All right, so for our Helen Frankenthaler watercolor flowers, we are going to be looking at learning about the warm colors. What colors are warm? We've got pinks, reds, oranges, and yellows. Those are warm colors. And we're going to be focusing on our cool colors. And the cool colors are purples, blues, and greens. Now let's first just focus on our warm colors. I am going to be experimenting and playing with using watercolor paint and different ways that we can use our watercolor paint. So watercolor, these are pan watercolors, so they're dry. It means you need to start yourself off with a wet brush. I'm going to dip my brush in the water. I'm going to wipe the extra water off, and I'm going to just swirl it gently. I'm swirling my brush on the watercolor. And then, so this is just a wet paint on dry paper. And that's what that looks like. If you want to change colors, wash your brush, wipe it, and then swirl that brush on another warm color. Let's go for orange this time. Ooh, orange. And then if I want to change colors, I gotta wash, wipe, and then swirl. Now you'll see my yellow, it has been tainted by some green. So I have to take a second, wash, wipe. I'm gonna wash it, wash my brush, wipe, wipe. So if you have dirty watercolors at home from mixing, that's okay. They're still good. Just gotta wash them. I'm gonna wash, wipe, boom. Let's see what this yellow looks like. I'm sure there's still a little bit of green in there, but I'm gonna see what I can do. Well, let's see. Yeah, it's a little green, but mostly yellow. All right, so that is wet on dry paper. So the paint is wet and the paper was dry. Now let's try something called wet on wet. So this is where you start off with clean water on a wet brush. And see my wet brush? I'm actually going to paint with the water on my paper. You might see it looks a little shiny. The light is hitting the water on the paper. And now that my paper is wet, I'm going to dip my brush in the water again, wipe it. This time I'm going to go into my red and watch what happens with the wet paint on the wet paper. See how it gets a little bleeding action? And it gets really fuzzy. It's cool and beautiful. And I love making my paper wet and then putting the wet paint on top. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to just make a little wet spot on my paper, and I'm just going to work in a little area at a time, because what happens? Well, the water dries eventually, and then the wet on wet magic doesn't really happen. And what you can do, what's really cool, is you can get a really wet brush and just see what happens. And just play. You can see the real fuzziness going on there. Let's put a little wet yellow on the wet paper. Oh man, that green's coming through. Yeah, maybe I can clean it off a little more. Sometimes you just gotta work with what you got, right? Actually, you know what I could do? Let's do some wet yellow. I'll do a big patch of wet yellow. And then let's throw some orange in there. Sometimes it's fun to put like a little drop of wet paint on a wet spot and see how it fuzzes and bleeds out a little bit. Let me get some red in there too. Maybe I'll put some red dots in between there. Nice. Now, if you have a spray bottle hanging around, you could also experiment with that. You can spray your paper first. You don't want it to be too wet, like gigantic puddles that drip and dribble. But it's nice to have a little bit of water on there. And then you can take your brush. I like to take my brush and just spread that water around a little bit more in case it's sitting on top of your paper. And then let's go ahead and see what we can do. Sometimes I like to make a line with my wet paint. I'll wash my brush and boop, just go like that. Make it bleed out a little bit more, spread and get fuzzy. All right, I'm gonna play with this and I'll show you what I have at the very end. Woo. Oh, maybe I'll do a little bit of, yeah, some layers with my warm colors in on my wet paper. So this is really just for you to experiment and play with the warm colors to start out, okay? We're just playing with different ways that we can use our watercolor paint, using our wet paint on a dry paper, and see what that does. And then we can also use our clean water to wet our paper first. And then see what happens when we use wet paint on a wet paper. Oh yeah. I'll show you what it looks like after I'm done playing. So I'm just going through and finishing up, filling in all the little blank spots I got. And you'll see this is a very abstract painting that we're doing right now. And that means we're not painting a picture of anything in particular. Abstract is just art that is focusing on the color and the lines and the shapes that you, the artist, are creating. And so what we're focusing on, yeah, we got some lines going on in here too, right? We got some shapes, but really our focus is on our warm colors for this one painting. Now I'm still playing around with, you know, wet paint on a wet paper in some areas. And in other areas, I am just going in with a nice strong color. And I am just laying down some nice, strong, solid color on a nice dry piece of the paper. So I'm gonna just go through, and I think I'm just about done. Yeah, see, I'm just gonna go through and do a little like, whoop, get some nice, strong pops of color in here, just for fun. And then I'm gonna move on to the next piece of this project, which is, guess what? Doing the same thing, but we're gonna be focusing on our cool colors. Yeah, so you're gonna do the same process, playing with your paint on your paper, using just your warm colors for this one. And then, now, I will let you know, when it's really wet paper and you've been painting on it, it's very fragile. See how floppity-loppity my paper is? You gotta be very careful. It's very fragile right now because it's so wet. So you don't want to rip it or handle it too much because it might tear, and you don't want to make a little hole in it either. So I'm gonna set this to the side, I'm gonna get my next paper out because we've got a whole bunch of cool colors to play around with too. I'll show you what my cool color paper looks like in just a second. All right, so here is my cool colored paper. I'm just going to town, adding some bright spots of green to my already painted paper, just because, you know, I like to pop a little extra color on there. Now, if you don't have pan watercolors at home, there are other ways that you could fill your paper with cool colors. My goodness, you could use your markers. Make sure, though, you are playing with your cool colors to cover the whole paper. And for the warm colored paper, make sure you use your warm colors, okay? And yes, pink you can add as a warm color. If you don't have markers at home, you could cover your paper with cool colored crayons or warm colored crayons. I mean, you could even use chalk if you have it at home. Also, food coloring, oh yeah. Put a little food coloring in a cup, add some water, swirl it around, and you've got yourself some paint. All right, these are very wet and fragile, and before we do our next step, they have to dry completely. So go play while your paper dries, and I'll show you the next step in a second. Well then, our warm colored paper and our cool colored paper, nice and dry. We're ready to transform these two pieces of paper into a lovely collage. I'm going to start out by cutting my warm colored paper, and I'm going to cut it into different size rectangles. Got some medium-ish ones, and then I'm going to get two bigger rectangles right here. These we're going to transform into some flowers. So what I like to do is I like to use the back of my paper, and I like to think about what kind of a flower do I want to cut out. You can use a marker, you can use a pen. I'm going to use a marker just so that you can see it better. I'm going to take and I'm going to make some big old curved lines like that. See that shape there? It's like a cloud. I'm going to use my scissors, and I'm going to go ahead and follow that line. It doesn't have to be perfectly on that line. If you want to, it can. But I'm just going to snip. Ready for the big reveal? Boom. Now you see that black marker I used? Went right through to the other side. No, it's okay. But now I can start making my bouquet of flowers. So there's a flower there. If you don't want to draw a flower, you can just take your scissors and kind of curve them around the edge of your paper. And look at that. That's a lovely little flowery shape. I'm going to try one of these big ones. Let's see what happens if I just cut out a big ovalish shape from this big rectangle. Boom. Oh, I like that. That's a really nice flower. You know what? I'm kind of liking how I'm using my imagination now. I'm visualizing. In my mind, I'm imagining these as being the flowers and the stems of the flowers coming down this way. See, I thought I wanted to do one that was tall, but now that I've cut these shapes out, I'm changing my mind. I like this. You know what? I'm gonna stop right there. I know I've got some more warm colored paper. I'm just gonna save these because what I want to do is I want to start laying down the rest of my flowers. And for that, I'm going to use the cool colored paper. Now the stems, super easy to cut. Now, this big paper, it's hard to handle. I'm going to go ahead and chop it in half. Take one side and put it to the side. This smaller piece is a lot easier for me. Now what I want to do is I want to think, how thick do I want the stems for my flowers? And look at that. I can just cut myself a straight line off and then zoop, slide it underneath that flower. Look at that. Maybe this one on the other side has a thinner stem. Oh, I like that blue spot right there. And then we've got this little guy down in front. Let's go ahead and, oh, I like that spot. Let's go ahead and we'll give this stem to this one. Boom. You know what our flowers might be needing? They might need some leaves. You know what I'm going to cut? A rectangle. Did you see that? Just cut a straight line. It's a big rectangle. I'm going to chop it in half. I've got two small ones. I'm going to make one side of my triangle, or I'm sorry, my rectangle pointy. And the other side, I'm going to make round. Check that out. It's a leaf made out of my cool colored paper. So see, take my rectangle. I want to make one end pointy. And then I'm going to curve the other end. Just like that. Just slide you little guys over. Hey, you know what? Look at these little triangles that I cut off. They could be like thorns that you might find on a rose. Look at that. Love it. I don't know what I'm going to do with this long skinny rectangle. Kind of want it to match that leaf. See if I can cut it a little pointy end. I'm going to round the other end. There we go. All right. You know some other ideas? You could take your marker. Go ahead and add a little center to your flower. Maybe some lines that come out to make it look like it's showing you the petals. Maybe over here. Got ourselves a nice little spiral flower. And this one, maybe just a line with another line and another and another. I'm going to put some circles at the ends of those lines. Nice little pattern. Just a nice little detail for a flower. The only thing that's left, well, is to glue it all down. Try not to sneeze or cough or blow, because you don't want these little pieces to go flying before you glue them down. Nice and tight in their new home. So I'm going to go ahead and finish gluing down my collage. And you can do the same with your collages at home. All right, go, make art. And I'll see you later.